All right, so if you're new to our Saved series as we're continuing to walk through this, we're taking some time to really dig into the Bible and understand what it means when we say that we have been saved. We know that it sounds simple, and for anyone who's been in church for any amount of time, the term salvation seems like an easy one to understand. But it's when you try to explain it to others that you realize how complex it really is. And those of us who try to communicate the truths in the Bible are noticing a problem. The simple answers that we've relied on for so long to talk about our faith aren't making sense to those who have no church background. It used to be that when somebody came to church, they'd probably been dragged to Sunday school by their grandma at some point, and so they at least had a little idea about Jesus and the major concepts in the Bible like sin and redemption. But now we're a couple of generations removed from Sunday school and from going to church just because it's the thing you do. So now most people don't have much of a foundation to build on. Adding to that, if we're going to be honest here, and we like to do that here, we in the church, frankly, we've rested on our laurels a little bit too much. And a lot of us would be hard-pressed to explain our own salvation as more than a ticket to heaven, or sin as more than not following a list of rules, or faith as more than just belief. But the truth is, the eternal focus on salvation is only the tip of the iceberg. Sin is not just simply failing to follow a list, and belief is only the first step in our journey. So now we're facing a situation where the people out there don't understand what we're trying to communicate, and sadly, in many cases, neither do we. So because of this, we're taking some time to look at the Bible, the 66 separate books, and examine why it is that they have been placed in this one book that we structure our life around. Specifically, we're looking at how this one book tells the story of salvation and how it all points us to that one place in time when Jesus died on the cross. So we're going along from beginning to end and studying the scriptures that record the pivotal moments in the biblical account of history and important moments where humanity's encounters with God reveal truths about our own place in this story that goes from the beginning of time, recorded time, all the way to a future that we haven't seen yet. So for the past couple of months, we've been in Genesis. And in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we've learned how what we do on earth is intrinsically linked to who we are as image bearers of God. In fact, it's that status as people who bear the image of God that will determine not just our identity, but how we invest the gift of life that's been given to us. We talked about how sin entered the world and how we now live in a version of creation that was corrupted, and how all of the story from the first chapters to the end is about God's plan to redeem his creation through humanity, not in spite of humanity. Then we talked about how God works through generations and how God has made promises and set laws in motion to guide us to be the people that God can work with as we step further on this path to redemption. Last week we ended by talking about faith and how belief is just the very beginning of how we should understand our faith. Because unless faith causes us to take steps down the road of God's plans for us, then it will never grow into what it was intended to be, and will never grow into that potential that God sees for us. Now, after Abraham, the rest of Genesis is dedicated to an era that we call the patriarchs, or the story of Abraham's descendants before the nation of Israel was established. And we have some fantastic stories in the last half of Genesis, stories that show us that God works through generations, but in a way that each new generation has its own choices to make. You know, it's interesting. I heard somebody say one time, it wasn't me, I heard somebody say that God has no grandchildren. And I think that that's really important for us to remember, especially as parents and grandparents. Your kids walk as your kids walk. And they have that same link to God that you do. Sometimes it's hard to remember that when you're in the, in the trenches of parenting. We have stories that demonstrate God's faithfulness to his covenant as his blessings move through Isaac and Jacob. And in these stories, we see the realities of living in a broken world, like betrayal and violence. But then we also see reconciliation, and the themes of faith and obedience continue to develop, as well as what happens generationally when we decide to walk in God's favor. And then we get to the story of Joseph. And I think I want to make this one last stop in this section of the Bible that we call the patriarchs before we move on to Exodus and the development of the Israelite nation. But before we turn to Genesis, I want to turn to the New Testament, because all the way over there, all the way after Jesus, there's a familiar verse that summarizes what I think is one of the main lessons that we learn with Joseph's story. Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. So I'm bringing up this verse because we're going to be seeing this principle in action through Joseph's life. Unfortunately, though, this verse in Romans is one of those verses that we have historically misunderstood. We're tackling a lot of these kinds of verses in this series because these are the misunderstandings that often lead others to reject faith in God. But in our egocentric culture, how many of us can agree that we kind of live in an egocentric culture, right? There's a very real temptation to read all things work together for good as all things work together for my good if I love the Lord. But that's not what it says. And if we teach it that way, then all it takes is for something not to work out, for someone to question if God is real. The truth is, coming to understand the difference between good and my good requires faith. This isn't an easy verse to understand, and when we try to make it easy, we turn God into the giant vending machine in the sky, existing only to make us feel better when things go wrong. But living like we know that things will work for good means that we embrace this truth with our willingness to set aside what we think might be best for us and allow God to work, even if that work doesn't look like it's going to prosper us personally. All things work together for good means that we have to give up the idea of my good and set it aside for a greater good that may or may not be what I perceive as meeting my immediate needs. If you remember, faith is about looking ahead and not being bound by the present, and as we'll see in Joseph's story, also not being bound by the past. Working for the good is about allowing our faith to help us take that first step on an unfamiliar road and giving that tiny mustard seed of faith what it will need to germinate and grow into a shape that we can't even predict, but we know in God's timing will be more beautiful than we could have ever imagined. So we're going to take a dive into Joseph's story so you can see this kind of faith at work over the course of Joseph's life, because this is the kind of faith that transforms us. Now, for some of you, this is going to be review. But just so we're all on the same page, I want to do a quick history lesson of how we get from Abraham to Joseph. You probably remember last week that Abraham is the father of Isaac. Then if we follow along there, Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have twin sons, Jacob and Esau. In these accounts, we see humans continuing to be human, surprise, surprise, and Jacob, under the advice of his mother, tricks his father Isaac into giving him the blessing that belonged to the firstborn Esau. So there's division in the family at that point. And Jacob, having tricked his brother, moves on and decides to marry a woman named Rachel. But Rachel's father, Laban, this whole sermon is going to be like intrigue. But Rachel's father, Laban, fools him though, and he ends up marrying her sister Leah, and then has to work longer for Laban to earn the right to marry Rachel too. And I think I should get some kind of prize for condensing that much of the Bible into a few sentences. Maybe a golden ladle. But on a side note, there are a lot of things in these stories that make modern readers cringe. Like the violence between tribes and slavery and how women are treated. And there are a lot of people outside of the church who point to these as examples of proof that the God we worship is not a good God who's worthy of our attention. But this is one of those places where the collective lack of knowledge about the Bible that is largely the result of our secular society has made it harder for us to communicate. And this is one of those reasons why we're studying the scriptures with the intention of demonstrating how they all work together in a way that points to Jesus. These scriptures are not glorifying violence or encouraging slavery or supporting the subjugation of women. These scriptures are describing a fallen world and how humanity failed to live with the love and justice that God desires. And if we look at Jesus' example, at how he treats people, at how he lifts up the weakest, and how he values those whom society dismisses, and how he rewrites our understanding of power, we, through his example, can catch a glimpse of God's vision for the world. And that vision isn't this. It isn't the way people we read about here treat each other. The reason these stories are in the Bible is because they reveal our weakness and our need for God, and then they reveal God's solution. So back to Joseph. Again, we see the fallout in relationships because of the corruption of the marriage covenant with Jacob's two wives, and jealousies and intrigue and all kinds of drama and scheming that develops because humanity, who thought they could decide good and evil for themselves, are once again failing to rule in justice. So Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel, that's his second wife, the one he wanted to marry first, ends up being unable to have children. And to try to make up for this, she gives Jacob her handmaid to have children with. And then when his other wife, Leah, stops having children, she does the same, giving Jacob her handmaid in this crazy drawn-out contest of who can keep having kids. But then suddenly, Rachel does have a child. And this child is Joseph, who's born when Jacob is old. So today we're going to pick up the story when Joseph is 17, but one thing I want to point out is how much life Joseph has been exposed to at this point. He has a ton of older brothers born to Jacob's other wife, Leah, and they couldn't stand him. His mother died giving birth to his younger brother, Benjamin. Like other children of the era, he would have worked as soon as he was physically able to do so. The concept of childhood, as we understand it, is a relatively modern invention that only came about because of the invention of the printing press. Did you know that? Before that, children had access to all the same information that adults did. So there really wasn't an idea that childhood was something that deserved special attention or that children should be shielded from certain realities. And this is a side note, but it's worth thinking about what's going to happen to the concept of childhood now that all information is once again available to kids because of our access to technology. But maybe that's a let's go out to dinner after church kind of conversation, or maybe something for the podcast. But back to the story, though. Joseph had lived a lot of life in his 17 years, and we'll see that everything that he had to face, the rejection from his brothers, the death of his mother, the conflicts with his family, and the wars and the resulting slaughter of other tribes and the hard work, he didn't have it easy. God had not given him a smooth path. So before we even get into this part of the story that we're going to cover today, I want to encourage you. If your path hasn't been easy, if you can look back and your history is littered with the kinds of things that no one should have to deal with, if you did nothing to deserve the hand you've been dealt, but now you just got to walk through it, you're not alone, and your trials aren't pointless. God will redeem them if you allow him to do it. This today is your story. It's for you. Sometimes faith requires that we trade in what seems to be our justified pain and resentment over the cards that we're holding so we can continue down the path that God has for us. There's a reason why Joseph's story covers so much real estate in our Bibles. We all have hardships to walk through, and we'll have trials in life. But if we keep our eyes on God's kingdom, instead of getting drawn into the lie that our own kingdoms are all there is, our trials will not be without meaning. All things work together for good. Today, some of us need to grab onto that and hold on tight. So I want to read Genesis 37, 1-11 to give us some background about Joseph's family dynamic. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age. And he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because his dreams and his words. He had another dream, and he told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you've had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So first of all in the story, we see that Joseph is sent out to meet his brothers. And he comes back and brings his father what the Bible tells us is a bad report. In other words, he was ratting them out for something that he thought their father wouldn't like. And there's so much going on here in the background that you have to wonder if Joseph chose to do this because he was just young and naive, or maybe he's trying to make himself look better to his father. It's hard to tell. But what we do know is that Joseph was the first son of Jacob's favorite wife, born to him in his old age, and he was Jacob's favorite, which is problematic anyway. I might step on some toes here, but parents, don't do this to your kids. Every kid deserves to be loved equally for their qualities and their struggles and for what they bring to the family. Just like the violence that's recorded in these passages, this favoritism is not a statement of the way things should be. This is a recounting of the brokenness that can persist in our relationships if we don't rely on God to change our own hearts. So Jacob had stuck his favorite son in the field with two of the oldest sons of his wife's maidservants. Even looking back thousands of years, we can see this setup and think that's probably not the best choice Jacob could have made. The truth is, Jacob's relationship with his own brother Esau had been destroyed by jealousy, and here Jacob is failing to protect his own children from that same fate. And these brothers were jealous, so Joseph goes out there strutting around in his new coat that his father had given him. And also, this wasn't just any coat. It was a long coat with long sleeves, something that was more royal than shepherd. It was the kind of coat that you didn't work in. But he shows up in the field to the brothers that are older and should have had seniority, but they don't because they're sons of the handmaids. And he's sporting this coat that makes it probably close to impossible for him to do any real work outside of advertising his status as the favorite. As much as possible, we want to avoid reading these stories with a modern sensibility to them, but I don't care what time you lived in, someone didn't think this through. There's not a lot of emotional intelligence being displayed here. So it says that the brothers hated him. Now, this isn't the kind of hate that's an attitude or a state of mind. This is the kind of hate that includes a sense of intention, like a bow and an arrow being pulled back and held. Something's going to happen. Also at this point, while we're concentrating on Joseph's experience, really, this story is being told through Jacob's point of view, this section of it. It begins with Jacob settling the land, and it ends with Jacob keeping all of these things that have happened between his sons in mind. And this is important because it explains a little about why the next part, starting with verse 5, the part about his dreams, is recorded in a way that doesn't highlight Joseph as an overly astute fellow. Right after he's wearing his spiffy robe out to the field, and right after he narks on his brothers, we are now going to hear his dream that's not subtle at all, that he went and told his brothers about, which is so out of place and oblivious that even his father, who considered Joseph to be his favorite, told him to be quiet. We'll see later, though, that what Joseph had seen in his dreams, that wasn't false. And their addition in the story is essential to our understanding of it. But there is a time and a place for everything, and knowing that's called wisdom. There are a lot of small lessons in these chapters, and this is one of those. You're going to get a lot of those this morning. You might be right about a situation with your family. You might want to speak the truth. But if you lack wisdom for how and when to have the conversation, the truth isn't going to be heard. But getting back to the main story. There are things about these encounters after his dreams that I think are very pertinent to our everyday lives. 3 things. First, God uses us even in our pride and our ridiculousness. God uses us even when we're young and dumb, or old and dumb. That happens too. God uses both our best and our worst. The thing is if we give it to God, he will use it. And in the case of our mistakes, that's a good thing. And not that I really have to say it, but let's try to give God our best instead of our worst. I mean, he'll redeem it. But I think more will get done if we decide to give God good things to work with. So the second point is that jealousy is often the door that lets sin into our lives. And strangely, it never seems to be directed at where would make the most sense. It would have made more sense for the brothers to be angry at Jacob for creating an atmosphere where there's a favored child, or for giving the younger brother the honor that should have been traditionally reserved for the older brother. But they weren't angry at Jacob. They were upset with Joseph. This is good for us to keep in mind. Usually when we get jealous, we often misdirect the resentment that we shouldn't be holding on to anyway. The third lesson that we can take away from this portion of the story is that no matter how we mess things up, God's plan still stands. We don't have enough power to create a situation that God can't use. So the next time you're awake at 2:38 a.m. thinking of all the dumb things you've ever said and reliving the embarrassment of your younger years, remind Satan that you're a child of God and that you're giving those mistakes to God to use. So moving on through the story. I'm going to skip ahead to when Jacob sent Joseph out again to find his brothers, and where we see the jealousy that had given birth to hate continued to stew. Genesis 37, 17 through 19. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." Sometimes when we read the Bible, maybe it's because it's such an important document and it's the basis for our faith, but we forget that sometimes it can be pretty funny if you think about it. Here young Joseph goes prancing around in his fancy coat to find his much older brothers after he had informed them about his dreams that he'd had, where they're all bowing down to him, and they see him in the distance, and they say to each other, "Here comes the dreamer." You can just about hear the collective eye rolls, right? And at this point in reading this, I'm almost starting to feel a little secondhand embarrassment for Joseph because he just seems so oblivious. Really, if they weren't conspiring to kill him, I'd almost start feeling sorry for the older brothers. But verse 20 tells us, "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of those pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." So I don't feel sorry for him anymore because they made some choices here. They've chosen to allow their jealousy to have power over their decisions. They've chosen to embrace hatred, and it's grown to a point where they no longer have the desire to control it. You know, one thing that I always tried to teach my kids is that they always have a choice. They can either choose to do their homework or not. They can choose to eat healthy or not. They can choose to listen to advice or not. Everything's a choice, but one thing we can't choose is the fact that we have to live with the consequences of our choices. It's so tempting to think that in life we should be able to make choices, especially the small ones, without facing the consequences. And that's what the older brothers did. They thought they could harbor resentment, that they could choose to stay jealous and hoard their anger, but that kind of choice has a price associated with it. We can't hold on to resentment or anger or jealousy or bitterness without it affecting our own life and outlook. And the brothers chose not to see this. They didn't see how their hearts were hardening. They didn't see the shift from jealousy to the kind of hatred that demands action, that has intention built into it. So they fell to the temptation to think that they could come up with a resolution to their anger outside of the only resolution that works, and that's forgiveness. They had a choice. For as ridiculous as Joseph acted, talking about his dreams and wearing his special coat, even though he knew it made him stand out, they could have chosen to chalk it up to Joseph's choices and being young and naive. But they didn't. They chose to keep it inside until the feeling demanded satisfaction. And this is the way to pretty much all sin. James 1:14-15. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then, when desire has conceived, it engenders sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. In this case, their desire, their jealousy, gives way to hate, and quite literally is giving birth to death. But in verses 21-24, but when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to their father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe with long sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. In the end, they sell him into slavery into Egypt. Put goat's blood on the coat to trick their father into believing that Joseph had been eaten by animals, and then they continue on living their lives. Of course, we get to read about Jacob mourning the death of his favorite son, but while this is happening, Joseph is on a new path, away from his brothers, and for the first time, even though he's now a slave in another person's household, we see that those characteristics of being oblivious and unwise begin to develop and change into the kind of character that takes the worst of a situation and tries to make the best of it. All in all, the story takes about 10 chapters to play out, so we don't have time to go through all of the details. But in the household that Jacob is sold into, he continues to grow. I think it was probably his experience with his brothers that taught him that you can't predict what's going to happen. But here, God uses it. God uses their anger and everything else to put the people into the positions they needed to be in for God to shape the people he needed to work with. So Joseph, after he was sold into slavery, he continued to work. And Genesis 39, 1-2 says, "Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had." You know, it might feel like everything has gone wrong in your life. You might be in a place where you never imagined you'd end up. But you're not off God's path. God's presence is unrelenting. The Lord was with Joseph. The words are so simple, but so true. And as Joseph worked for the person who owned him, both of them prospered. And we might be tempted to think that this is where the story ends. After all, how could it be better for anyone who had become a slave? But our endings are not God's endings. There's a greater purpose, and God had to continue to move Joseph because his work was not yet done. Feeling like we are free is not the same as being free. God wasn't done. And if you're living in bondage to something in your life, I don't care how you feel or how successful you look, God's got more for you. So with Joseph, the drama continues. The Bible tells us that Joseph had grown up to be pretty attractive. At least that's what the owner's wife thought. And she was after him. I tell you what, preaching this sermon feels a little bit less like preaching and more like I'm just spilling the tea, you know? But Joseph had another decision to make here. And it isn't just the physical temptation. You see, an affair with Potiphar's wife could have been a retaliation for the fact that he'd been purchased in the first place. An affair with his wife could have given Joseph more status in the household, and he could have blamed it on her because she was the pursuer. He ran from the temptation, though. And here's another place where everything could have looked like it was going wrong because she accused him of going after her and he ended up in prison anyway. But Genesis 39, 21-23, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in prison, and whatever was done, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." You see, sometimes in life, things can go back and forth for a while. Joseph's story demonstrates that when we, like Joseph, continue to live the way we should, when we continue to make the right choices, even when everything tells us we should give it up, even when we are in prison precisely because we didn't do the thing that we're accused of, God continues to prepare us for what's next. For Joseph, who'd been thrown in a pit, sold as a slave, worked to build a life, resisted temptation, only to lose everything again and wind up in another pit of prison, he didn't give up. And here's another takeaway. On the outside, to everyone else, it might look like you're failing. But if you are doing what God has told you to do, if you are walking the muddy, hard path and keeping your eyes on the truth, that your future is still in front of you and that this is not all God has planned for you, let them talk. It doesn't matter. God has something more for you. Now, while Joseph was in prison, things kept happening. The cupbearer and the baker who served the Pharaoh did something to offend the Pharaoh, and they wound up in the same prison as Joseph. And they ended up being charged all together. One night, though, they also had dreams. Now, earlier in the story, we've already seen that God works through dreams with Joseph. So we aren't surprised when Joseph is able to interpret these dreams for the two he's sharing prison with. Here's another lesson. God may have given you a gift, but just because you haven't doesn't mean it's God's timing for you to use it. Remember that word prepare from last week? If God isn't using the gift he has given you yet, keep working at it. Keep giving it to him. The time simply isn't right. And the time certainly wasn't right for Joseph when he spouted off to his brothers in the beginning of the story about how they would bow down to him. Joseph had to learn some wisdom. And he had a chance to exercise that wisdom here because the dreams of these two men came true. But when one of them was restored to the house of Pharaoh, he forgot Joseph. And how Joseph had served him. So Joseph waited 2 more years. That's a long time. We get mad if it's like we haven't heard back from somebody in a week. Then, though, after that 2 years, he had an opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And when he does, he foresees a famine that will decimate Egypt and the surrounding areas. And there's a lot of twists and turns, but Pharaoh ends up making Joseph the man in charge of readying the country for the famine and seeing them through the famine by storing up large amounts of grain and making wise purchases and putting actions into plans that would make sure that Egypt survives. Eventually, Joseph becomes governor. And then, as Joseph is seated in that position of power, his brothers walk in, hoping to find respite from the famine because the drought had taken everything. And like Joseph's dream at the very beginning, they bow before him, not even recognizing who he was. Worship team, you can come back up. God's plan always stands. And as people of faith, we need to start resting in this fact. You see, through all of this, Joseph was becoming the person God would use to save the lives of the family that would become the nation of Israel. The people through which the entire world would be blessed. God took that little braggy kid and made sure the nation of Israel survived. God, by way of a twisty-turny, difficult path, shaped Joseph so he could be in the position to save his family. Before we leave the story, I want to point out one more thing. In Joseph, we have another archetype of Jesus. Remember, the Bible gives us lessons from individual stories, but each of these stories are also telling the larger narrative. The story of Joseph makes sure that when Jesus arrives, humanity recognizes him and looks to him because, like Joseph, Jesus suffered what he didn't deserve for people who wouldn't recognize him. And because of that, like Joseph's brothers who were mired in their own jealousies and sin, we are saved. It all points to Jesus. But the thing that I want you to take away today is that no matter where you are, no matter what other people think, no matter if you've made mistakes, God has a plan. And God will use everything you give him to use, the good and the bad. So the question this morning is there something that you need to give to God? Is there a situation that you can't make heads or tails of? Can't figure out how God's going to use it? I invite you to stand if you can. You have no idea how God's going to use it. But this morning, are you willing to take that mustard seed of faith out of your pocket and plant it. Maybe you've had a rough go, and this morning God's telling you, give it to Him. Give it to Him. Not just so that we feel relieved, although that's part of it, but give it to Him so God can use it for the good that only God can see.